Well, hey everybody, welcome to Celebrate Recovery. I'm so excited that you joined us tonight in what should be one of our last few weeks of meeting digitally. I just wanted to share a word of hope with you here before we worship tonight, and then we have a great talk lined up tonight that's also going to continue into next week. So I hope you join us next week as well for the conclusion of the talk that we start tonight. In the book of Micah, the prophet comes to a conclusion near the end of the book where he's talking about his circumstances, and he's saying, basically he's admitting, hey, everything's really uncertain right now, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's all these people I thought I could trust in, and there are these situations and really solid things in my life that I thought I could trust, and you know what? They've all abandoned me. They've all failed me. And he comes to this point in chapter 7, and I want to read this verse with you guys tonight. He says, "But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me." We can always be confident in everything that's going on and everything that's happening around us, whether it's people who fail us or a government who fails us or a situation changes so rapidly that we don't know what to think, that God will hear us. And our God is the God of our salvation. He's not some far off, vague kind of mystical God that we can't understand. He's the God who's communicated to us and with us in a way we can understand and in a way that can bring us hope. So tonight, if there's one thing I hope you hear from our talk and from our worship, is that God hears you and you can trust in Him. But now I want you to stand with us and worship where you are.
I count on one thing, the same God who never fails, will not fail me now. You won't fail me now. In the waiting, Father, we choose to worship you no matter what the circumstance, no matter what's happening. We choose to lift our eyes to see that you're working in all things for good. Lord, I pray that even as we just take time to lean in, Lord, we pray that you would speak powerfully to our hearts. We know that, God, you're the same God who made the universe. You're the God who holds it all and holds it all together, but you're also the God who would call us friend, and who would care for us, and who would love us even while we were enemies to you. So right now we lean in to all that you have to say. Even as we're behind computer screens and in different places, Lord, I pray that you would knit our hearts together. Lord, we love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, hello again, everybody. Again, just thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for being a part of our worship. I'm joined tonight here by my friend Kim. If you've been around CR for any kind of length of time, you've probably seen him because he towers above the rest of us, at least. So Kim he's a really great guy. If you haven't had the privilege of meeting him, I'd encourage you to. He's got a tremendous amount of knowledge, and he's really just an interesting guy. And I spent a lot of time with him, and we've had a lot of different conversations that range from, the very shallow to quite deep. And again, I'm just really fond of him. And as we've talked, there's been one topic that has kind of come up more and more, and it's really the kind of topic that, as you step back and you begin to see, it's undergirding just a lot of different facets of recovery and life in general, and it touches people in every demographic all across the world. And that is the lighthearted topic of shame, right? That's the one we've talked about. And so what we wanted to do here, we're going to take 2 weeks to do it, is just have a conversation about shame and try to communicate how there's hope, even though shame does exist, and to maybe identify a few areas in our lives where we were not aware shame even existed, and then maybe some steps forward about how we can resolve that. So to start out, I just want to ask Kim here, can you share with us maybe just a working definition, just what is shame in a sentence or two?
I'm glad you asked me that question, because I'm very prepared for that. So I can get to my notes.
Small talk, small talk, small talk.
I came up with a definition based on my own experience with shame and treating addicts as a therapist. But this is really straight from my heart. It's a sense of inner badness developed as a result of ongoing shame experiences of abuse, including sexual, physical, emotional, and verbal.
Right. So shame, it's really one of those things that we don't even necessarily. It's almost redundant to define it, just because we all know it. It's very common and to the human experience, and it has been for as long as we can possibly remember. But can you, some of those examples you're reading at the end, give us a few examples of shame, how shame occurs.
Well, shame can occur when someone is being sexual with a child. Obviously, any contact with a child sexually is wrong and very shameful. Another example would be physical abuse. One of the things that happened to me a lot in my family was if you made a mistake, like if you spilt your milk, you would get slapped. So slapping and punching a child is definitely abuse, and it's very shameful to the child. Another one, hate to bring my family into it, but silent treatment is a form of shame and abuse, and my mother used to do that to me. She was very driven to get her work done, and she didn't want for me to be in the way. So she would get angry with me, and she wouldn't speak to me sometimes for a day or two, and that was very painful to me. So those are some, any kind of put downs, yelling, screaming at a child makes them feel bad about themselves, and that starts the process of shame developing in a child's heart.
And so shame is really one of those things that it occurs on all different sides of these. And so in some of those examples, you were talking about shame that is inflicted on you, right? And then there's also shame from the other side of things. So if you have shamed someone, there's shame associated with that. How would you kind of separate those two kinds of shame, whether it's something done to you or something you do?
Well, I basically call that one the personal shame. Is when you do something that's embarrassing. That's personal shame. An example of that is in one of my weakest moments, I put some dog poop in a washing machine because I was angry with my wife because she was kicking me out. And when I realized that she was going to tell all of her family members that I did that I was very ashamed, and I did talk to her and I apologized for doing that. But you do some crazy things in the arms of shame.
And in the throes of that struggle and all the things. And so it's really kind of crazy that shame, in that instance, shame perpetuates shame.
That's right.
Because you were dealing with it. And so some of the other examples you talked about at the beginning, and we're very clear in Celebrate Recovery that victimization, is not the fault of the victim, right? We never blame the victim. And so we understand that shame, which I think you call toxic shame,
yes,
shame that is inflicted upon you, whether it has been sexual, verbal, or physical abuse, that is shame with which you must deal, but it's not something that is your fault. So there's shame that we cause in ourselves by our actions, like poop in the washing machine. And then there's also shame that is inflicted upon us. But both of them are very, very, very real.
That's right.
Right. But it's also kind of sinister because there's another emotion that is very easily confused with shame. If we think about guilt, right?
Yeah.
So how do we tell those apart? What's the difference between them?
Well, with guilt, you experience things through your mind. It's about your thoughts. I did something wrong. The one thing, God is an opportunist, so He will use guilt to convict us of our sin, to get us to turn around. And a lot of times we can turn back toward God, repent and ask Him for forgiveness, and He's used something like guilt to turn a person's behavior around. But with shame, that is a hard experience. That's about your feelings, how you feel about things. But shame is about who you are. It's about your identity. It's really about feeling humiliated, about feeling ashamed. And it's also some of the ways that people feel toxic shame is they feel like they're bad to the core of their being. They feel defective, and a lot of times they don't have any hope that they can ever change and ever feel differently about themselves. That's really important, and that was something that I experienced quite a bit as a child. As I felt like I was defective, I was because I was actually sexually abused as a child, so I felt that defection. I felt like I was bad to the core of my being, and there was nothing I could do to separate myself from that shame. So I spent a lot of my time trying to cover up this toxic shame, but I couldn't do it. I would isolate myself away from other friends. I would just spend a lot of time alone. I even developed a social phobia from all the shame I experienced in my childhood, to the point where doing what I'm doing right now would be very difficult. If God hadn't have done a lot of healing in my heart, I would not have been able to sit right here and talk about shame like we are doing.
And that is where we're headed, ultimately, is we're headed towards how can God heal us from this. But really, as we've talked, we've met several times and talked about this, and one of the most eye-opening things for me is the fact that shame causes certain behaviors, but then shame results from those behaviors, and it's this perpetuating thing, and a lot of times we don't even know we're there. So I think one of the best ways to frame it is, let's take it all the way back to the beginning and say, can you explain from a biblical point of view, where did shame originate? How did it come to be a reality? Because like we said, we don't even have to define it. We know it's so real. But if we're trying to flesh these things out, where did shame begin?
I'd like to read an excerpt from this book called Core 52 by Mark Moore. Actually, it was a book that Neil introduced to me, and it depicts the fall in such a way I thought would be a great way to get started in talking about that. And he says, the title is The Fall. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took it, the fruit, and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And then he goes on to depict the fall of man in Genesis 3. The story is told in Genesis 3. It begins with a naked woman, a talking serpent, forbidden fruit, and a passive husband idly standing by. Eve knew the fruit was off limits, yet the serpent's seduction won the day. She took the bait and a bite, while her husband stood dumb, but not deaf beside her. Her eyes were open to evil, to her naked body, and to the coming curse. First, we must ask ourselves what captivated Eve's attention, because it's the same thing that happens to us. Eve saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to her eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise. What seduced her was Satan's half-truths in the previous verse. You will be like God. That's it. This is the temptation of self-determination, the promise that we can direct our own affairs and determine our own destinies. Pride becomes our Achilles heel. Pride isn't merely a sin, it is the sin.
And so in that moment, Eve has believed deception. She's in the garden, and it's not just that she believed deception. There's some really alluring, very graphic details there about there's a lust after something. She saw it was good, and she wanted it, and then she fell into all these different lies, and ultimately we know sin was committed, right? Yeah. And then how did shame follow that act? How was it shameful, or how did that result in shame?
Well, in the garden, God only had one rule, and that was not to eat from the tree of good and evil. But Satan had a rebellious nature, and he wanted to rule over God. To do so, he thought of a plan that if he could get Adam and Eve to sin, then he could have control over them. And when you see the setting in Genesis 3, all of a sudden the serpent appears, and the Bible says that he's very cunning. And he was very persuasive to shame Eve into believing that being dependent on God was a very shameful thing. So he manipulated her because I think that maybe he realized that he would have a much tougher time with Adam for some reason. So he isolated Eve in the garden and started talking to her and telling her that what God had said to her about if you eat from this tree that you will surely die. And he said he basically called God a liar and said, that's not true. If you eat the fruit, then you will become just like God. You'll become his equal. And I was prompted at that point to think, that is the root of the New Age movement, is thinking that you can become your own God. So that's, and Satan used what they call a threefold technique with that. He realized that there was three ways that he could get Eve to eat the fruit. The first one would be the tree was good for food, the lust of the flesh. The second one was pleasant to the eyes, lust of the eyes. And the third one was to make one wise, pride of life. So he was able to get her to eat the fruit, and she ate it, and her eyes were open. And she got Eve to eat the fruit, and his eyes were open, and they all realized they were naked. And so in that moment, they must have felt some fear. They knew they had done something wrong. And guess what they did? They ran and hid. They ran and hid, and they were hiding from God because they were ashamed of themselves because they did something wrong. He told them not to do. The only thing he told them that they couldn't do, they did. They ate of the fruit, and then that was the beginning of the fall of man.
And so ultimately, you know, when you think about they covered themselves, you know, the text talks about it, and like you said, their eyes were opened, and they knew what they had done was wrong, and they realized they were naked. And there's this imagery in there about identity, because in that moment they realized they had misused their identity, because God had defined who they were. He had told them what truth was, and they had departed from that, and they had gone away from it. So in covering themselves, what they were trying to do was to mask their broken identity. And that's really where shame sort of bubbles to the surface, like you said before, is with our identity. So, you know, we think about shame, and we think about our identity, and you got all this stuff going on in the garden. And that, of course, it comes all the way down to us. So we've established that shame is this inner sense of badness, and that it's so intrinsic to us. You know, you don't have to teach a toddler to be ashamed. I mean, they can. It's in them, right?
Intrinsic.
Yeah, exactly. It's in them. So if this thing is so pervasive and so intrinsic, like you said, and we don't have to learn to do it, why are so many people unaware of shame? Why you know, we talked at the beginning about we confuse it with guilt, but why are we unaware of shame that is inside of us?
I think one of the reasons is shame is so painful. It's in some cases, depending on what's happened to the person, it's intolerable. And I've even found that with talking to other counselors, other pastors, that it's a very uncomfortable topic that most people don't want to talk about because it is so painful. And in that pain, you know, the whole premise of trying to avoid shame is running and hiding and covering yourself. And that's what we do today, is that we are always trying to cover up ourselves so we won't be exposed to that shame, because we don't want to experience it anymore, because we already felt it once and we don't want to feel it anymore. So I think it's such a painful topic that people would rather just not talk about it and just avoid it. And that's my experience. It takes really, to help someone recover from shame, you have to create a safe environment for them to feel good enough, feel safe enough to be able to talk about something that happened to them that no one would really want to talk about, especially things like sexual abuse. The people that I've worked with that have been sexually abused, it's very difficult for them talking about it. But once you're able to talk about it, and the secret's out, you start to feel, you start to feel better about it. So I can actually overcome some of this. God can actually change my heart, and I can really begin to feel better about myself. And so that's a good place for somebody to be that had shame and didn't want to talk about it.
How do you, I guess in your experience, how do you see, what lengths do people go to? How do people try to hide their shame? You know, because we don't want to confess it's real. You know, it's our secret, and so we're gonna hide it. But a lot of times people will go to great lengths to hide it. How have you seen people will try to hide and manage their shame?
Well, it can manifest itself in many different ways, but number one is addictions.
Okay.
You know, if you're in pain and something takes care of that pain, then they can become addicted to it. There's so many ways people try to hide their shame. That they can become arrogant, they can become angry, they can become condescending. And a lot of people that are insecure because of shame act like they're better than other people, and that they have this superiority complex.
Yes.
So those are ways that some people actually hide their shame. 50% of all the prisoners in jail have experienced some shame. People that have eating disorders, that's driven by shame. Codependency is driven by shame.
Yeah.
So all those things are a way of covering and avoiding facing something that's very difficult to face. But my experience is once you're able to face your shame, then you begin to see things begin to change from the inside out.
And really, it takes us back to the garden, right? Because we established that when the way shame came in, it was a misuse of the identity. So shame attacks us at the core, our very identity. And so sometimes it's sort of sinister and deceptive because we don't know what's going on. All we know is there is pain associated with it. So I might hide it in a drug addiction, or I might take on a new persona, right? Just like I'm Superman and I got to hide my true identity, I'm going to assume a false identity. I'm going to become this other person to hide that pain.
Well, that's another thing that we do is we wear masks.
Yeah.
So people can't see. Because when you have shame, especially shame inside of you that's never been dealt with, you're always looking for a way to hide it. And you don't want to, the worst thing that can happen with shame is somehow your shame gets exposed to people and you don't want it to. So people wear a mask and you never really get to know who they really is as long as that shame's in place.
And we know in Celebrate Recovery, you actually quoted it earlier, we know that we're only as sick as our secrets, right? And so shame is, it lends itself to secrecy because it's painful, and it's more painful initially to face it than to ignore it in that moment. But as you all know, watching, and as you've heard testimonies, what our addictions and our codependencies and all these things do to us is they exaggerate that pain. They actually add on top of it, and it becomes this thing where when we hit bottom, when we truly bottom out from our addiction or our anxiety, whatever it may be, the shame almost becomes unbearable, right? But there is a path to healing here, and there is possibility of healing from it, and the healing is better than the hiding. I can absolutely promise you. And shame is so damaging because of that. It lends itself to secrecy. But I got a question for you. Is again, we want to communicate hope, and what we want to do is for people to be able to identify the fact that there is shame, that shame is something that wants to stay in the dark, and you want to keep it in the dark. But then that ultimately there is a path to healing that is better than the hiding. So Kim, can you tell me how can God possibly work good through our shame? Because I believe he can. I firmly believe he can, and I believe I've seen it. And I think you've seen and experienced that too. But how can God work good through our shame?
I think he can take anything that's meant for evil and turn it around. And I think, like I said before, when people get in a safe environment, they can start to heal from their shame. As long as if they let the truth out about what's happened to them, they can start the healing process. And you hear people say it many times that I'm grateful for my addiction because of what it's done for me. And I think the same with shame. Once you get through the beginning phases of, oh, this is so painful, I don't want to deal with it, and you start to realize that after you start to deal with it and you get on the other side, that it's a much more pleasant place to be than to try to deal with shame, especially if it's toxic shame, something that's intolerable. So I think that in dealing with your shame, especially with a pastor or with a counselor, you can start to see God working in your life and changing your heart. And essentially when you get abused as a child, you lose your power. But in that process, God can give you your power back to be who you are. And that's, Satan's lie is that, you're never going to recover from this. You're never going to know your true calling. You might as well just, give up and quit. But God will use your pain to make you grow stronger and grow you up in lots of ways. So I've seen lots of people recover from addiction and from shame and go on to do great things.
Right, and even, Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians. He says that our this light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And we are not sitting here saying shame is good. It's the narrative in Genesis doesn't say, and on the third day God created shame and it was good. that is reserved for after the fall. So we understand as two people who have dealt with shame in our lives and who have dealt with it in a myriad of ways trying to cover it up, and who have in turn seen God heal, that shame is painful, very painful, and it's a very dark place, and that it results from a lot of different things, but that inner sense that you are less than what God made you, right? That because of your sin, you are somehow less of a being. That is a lie of shame. And shame is a very powerful thing in your life. And so what we want to do tonight is just to communicate hope to you that we serve a God who is capable of bringing beauty from the ashes, and he can take shame and he can heal you from it, and in turn help you to use that to comfort others, to bring others to a place of healing. And that is a reality. Don't think that we're sitting on the other side of the camera just like, hey, I got to fill time this week. What I want to do is communicate to you that shame is not the end. Shame is not where you are destined to stay. God has much better plans for you, and he wants to heal you from that shame. Kim, I really appreciate you being here, and I really look forward to the next talk we're going to have, where we sort of try and put some legs on how do we begin to move out of shame. So we've identified it as a reality. Everyone knows it in our lives. We've seen the devastating effects of it. We've seen how we will, what extent we'll go to try to cover it up. But next week we're going to talk about, okay, so knowing the reality of it, I'm willing to face it. Where do I go now? How do I begin the process of allowing God to heal me from this shame? I really appreciate you guys joining us tonight, and I hope you were blessed through this talk. I know I have been through our talks, and I hope you will join us next week. But until then, hope you have a great week.